Now, in anticipation of our stretching exercise soon, I'd actually like you all to cross your fingers and toes now, because this is our last video presentation. So don't breathe, don't turn on the internet, no, not at all. Our next speaker is Tom Brideson, who'll be very familiar to many of you. Tom is, of course, the CEO of EW, Proud Spirit. He is previously the statewide coordinator for the New South Wales Aboriginal Mental Health Workforce Program, leading on to becoming a Deputy Commissioner in the Mental Health Commission of New South Wales. And Tom today is going to talk about equally well issues for the First Nation Australians. Welcome, Tom.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to commence by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we are all either meeting on or come from, and pay respects to elders past and present and emerging. My name is Tom Brideson. I'm the CEO of EW Proud Spirit Australia, and we're a policy leadership group in the area around social emotional wellbeing, mental health and suicide prevention. I'm very thankful for the invitation from Equally Well today, and look forward to the feedback that takes place in regards to the entire symposium. I'm a Kamilaroi man, born in Gunnedah, New South Wales, and been involved in the mental health area for the last 30 odd years, specifically around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Now I'm just going to release my computer screen. I think. Yeah. Okay. This is our governance arrangements in regards to the board and our patron, and many of the people would be known to the audience, and I won't go through them all. This presentation can be made available to anyone following the conference or symposium. But what I can say is that there's a team of real champions on our board. I just wanted to start a couple of things by saying, firstly, the Aboriginal definition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander definition of health, and how it influences the work in which we do, but also the work in which Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people do. That health is not is about the individual within the family, within the community. So there's a broad approach to language and to the way in which we define things, in particular, a broad aspect in regards to mental health. And I just wanted to highlight, I guess, some of the areas around language and that type of thing that incorporates a holistic view from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The work, the three documents that are on the left-hand side are really the work of EW now, and for the first time in the 5th National Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Plan was a priority that was provided, I guess, in the context for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Now that's, I guess, probably after 25 or 30 years of advocacy, the first time priority for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people was in 2017. And And next one. Oh my goodness. It's not working. Okay. But since the 5th National Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Plan, we thought we were in a bit of good space, given that it was a priority, and there's been a whole lot of developments that have taken place since then. Suicide Prevention Advisor was appointed by the Prime Minister, provided a report back in December 2020. The Productivity Commission done a report into mental health, and we provided that in 2020. COAG was essentially, so the governance arrangements around the 5th National Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Plan was replaced by the National Cabinet. The COVID pandemic and the responses to that are continuing. There's a parliamentary inquiry into mental health, and the national reform agenda for mental health and suicide prevention, and just recently the National Agreement for Mental Health and Suicide Prevention was released. There was also the National Agreement for Closing the Gap that took place in July in 2020. And during this time, there's been workforce strategies that are just everywhere, particularly around health and human services. So fast forwarding to now, the 3 pieces of work are still in play, and now we have these 3 pieces of work leading into both the National Agreement on Closing the Gap and the National Agreement around mental health and suicide prevention. And it's pretty important that that we consider this in the context of ensuring the alignment of policies and the alignment of our work into the future. I've decided not to go into the horror stories around the stats that exist. I think people are well aware of the stats that exist around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's health and social circumstances, but I prefer to look at these things at the moment in a real strengths-based approach to the way in which we deal with the way in which we work with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So the narrative is really important here, and the narrative has changed quite a bit. And that narrative is reflected in the Closing the Gap report just released recently around transforming power, the voices for generational change. There's also changes to the language and the strengths-based approach that is listed in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Plan. Now, one of the things that has emerged out of the Closing the Gap National Agreement is that there's a whole lot of targets, and I won't go into those today, but there's one around social emotional wellbeing, target 14, which is to significantly and sustained reduction in suicide for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and there's a whole lot of sort of indicators that sit around that. So the essence around the National Agreement commits governments to building and strengthening structures that empower Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to share decision-making authority with governments to accelerate policy and place-based progress on closing the gap. And Gay Jury Proud Spirit Australia will lead the work of that policy partnership in regards as from the Coalition of Peaks, and will co-chair that arrangement with government around that policy partnership. And just in regards to the diagram on the right-hand side, that's where these things sit in terms of looking down the bottom. What we've got is Coalition of Peak members and also Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representatives of equal numbers to those representatives of government. So there'll be 10 across those two areas of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representatives and also the Coalition of Peak representatives. There'll be equal numbers of government representatives that has the Commonwealth and all states and territories involved in that process. So we will co-chair that alongside government and report back into the Coalition of Peaks. We'll report back into the Partnership Working Group, which will report into the Joint Council, and any recommendations that are made will go to Joint Council. So that is currently, it's Pat Turner from the Coalition of Peaks as one of the co-chairs of the Joint Council, and Minister Ken Wyatt, who's the other co-chair. I just wanted to sort of touch on language and the types of things. And I think where I'm really excited about is the way in which Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have influenced language across the entire mental health space, I believe. Back in 1995, there was the Ways Forward report, and they talked about this whole big, broad concept around social emotional wellbeing. And much of that language is sort of influenced and filtered into many of the areas around mental health and social emotional wellbeing now. So looking at the consensus statement from Equally Well, looking at a holistic person-centred approach to physical and mental health and wellbeing, looking at effective promotion, prevention, early intervention, looking at equity of access to all services, improving the quality of health care, care coordination and regional integration across health, mental health and other services and sectors which enable contributing life, and then monitoring progress to improve towards improvements of physical and mental health wellbeing. Moving into the national agreement around mental health and suicide prevention, is that the Commonwealth and states are working in partnership for a unified, integrated mental health and suicide prevention system to improve the mental health and wellbeing of the Aboriginal population, with a focus on improving outcomes for priority populations, and Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people are certainly one of those priority populations. It's a continuation of the fifth plan, so to speak, as a priority. So reducing suicides, suicidal distress and self-harm through a whole of government approach, through coordinated prevention, early intervention, aftercare, post-vention supports, providing a balanced and integrated mental health and suicide prevention system for all communities and groups, improving the physical health and life expectancy for people living in with mental health conditions, and for those experiencing suicidal distress. But importantly, improving the quality, safety and capacity of the Australian mental health and suicide prevention systems. And then we get into the language around the Closing the Gap National Agreement, and it's this language around shared decision making. And, you know, this is really sort of getting down to the crux of what I wanted to speak about, was the language and how we use language in a way that's, you know, quite positive and very focused around the future and how do we actually do that. So Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are empowered to share decision-making authority with governments to accelerate policy and place-based progress on closing the gap through formal partnership agreements. Building the community control sector, absolutely critical point in regards to that there's strong and sustainable Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community control sector delivering already, but delivering high quality services to meet the needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across the country. Improving the mainstream institutions, so the governments and their organisations and their institutions are accountable for closing the gap and are culturally safe and responsive to the needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, including through the services they fund. And then we get down to the areas around data and, importantly, having Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander-led data initiatives that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have access to and capability to use locally relevant data and information to set and monitor the implementation efforts of to close the gap, their priorities, and drive their own development. And I mentioned earlier around the targets in regards to closing the gap. There's 16 of those. They're listed in the national agreement. They run from children, early years, right through to areas that are really important, such as suicides, reducing suicides, such as improving mental health outcomes, and a whole lot of other areas around that. So our job at Gay Jury is really trying to influence the space around all policy areas of mental health and Aboriginal health across the landscape. So 3 strategies that are up here now are really about the mental health workforce, and I was co-chair of that task force. That work, as I understand it, is currently with states and territories, and I believe once it's agreed to, it'll be released. The lived experience workforce, underpinning all of our work, is around lived experience, and the lived experience of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, which is quite different, I guess. We've got areas around mental health specifically, but there's a whole space of trauma, transgenerational trauma, and we need to sort of factor that into the equation as well. And importantly, the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Workforce Strategic Framework and Implementation Plan. So looking at our workforce, looking at the broader workforce, looking at the lived experience workforce, absolutely critical. And I'll get to that. One of the things, and where I talk about the value of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the ways in which we do things, this definition that was adopted and slightly adjusted comes, which is part of the National Mental Health Workforce Strategy, comes from the National Strategic Framework for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's mental health and social emotional wellbeing in the current document, which is at attachment 3. And what it's saying is that the workforce is broadly defined. It's, we've gone down these roads of the precious 5 professions, and, that's not any disrespect to the professions, but COVID, if nothing else, has given us a real opportunity to look beyond in regards to mental health care and importantly, looking after people's mental health and their physical needs in regards to the arrangements. And this definition talks to the entire workforce, so across health and human services, but it doesn't stop there. It's a workforce that extends into many, many areas that have, it might be first points of call in regards to identifying and responding to, potentially helping people in regards to mental health care. And one of the things that I'll make quick mention of is the context around when the drought was happening. And I was located in Orange at the time, and we were doing some work with the Centre for Rural Remote Mental Health at the time. And it was about connecting with bank managers. It was about connecting with stock and station agents. It was about connecting with rural counsellors and so forth. It wasn't about connecting with mental health services per se alone. It was about connecting with those who connect with those who are affected by drought. So in that same context, we started to sort of unpack and put together, well, who are these people that are out there? And how do we make these connections across this workforce that are really valuable and necessary? We're not going to just have a system of the 5 professions that are going to, essentially resolve the mental health issues certainly for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but for anyone. So it's a big, broad brush that we took in regards to the National Mental Health Workforce Strategy. And I think that's pretty much, I can go into one other slide, and this is just really quickly, just about the nature of Gayatri and how it operates and the notions of collective excellence. So we don't do this work alone. We've got a board of 7, we've got a patron, we've got a secretariat that sits here in Canberra at Old Parliament House currently, but we've got a clinical counsel and a cultural counsel that feed into the board and the secretariat, and both of those groups, in fact, all of these groups have got about 9 people in those groups. Sitting and feeding into the secretariat of Gayatri is really the collaborative network. So we've got a network of LGBTIQ plus sister girls and brother boys. We've got a lived experience collaborative network. We've got a stolen generations collaborative network. We've got a workforce collaborative network and a youth collaborative network. And the essence of that is really to seek advice around or ensure that people are included in the decisions that Gayatri are making. So we're not making them alone. We're just ensuring that we've got really good sound processes around. So in essence, what we've got is about 70 or 80 odd people that are in the, or connected to the organisation, and really sort of looking at the way in which we do things. And so ensuring that we've got reality checks, ensuring that we're listening to voices, ensuring that we're valuing people's experiencing and embracing expertise and enhancing priorities. So that's where we are. And thank you so much.
Thank you, first of all, to all of our speakers in this pre-stretch session, Christine, Reza and Tom. You've done the best thing you can ever do for a chairperson. You've finished ahead of time. That is a beautiful thing. And the video worked, which makes me extremely happy.